Castlevania Aria of Sorrow is a 2003 release in the long-running Castlevania series and the third one released on Game Boy Advance. I've now beaten all three Castlevania games that were released for Game Boy Advance, and am able to compare each of them with one another. After beating them all, I can safely say they're all exceptional games, and I would recommend all three of them to any fan of Castlevania. I would especially, however, recommend the Game Boy Advance games to those who enjoyed Symphony of the Night, as that PlayStation title was highly influential on all three of these games. Let's start with the story. Now, just like other Castlevania games, Aria of Sorrow doesn't spend too much time dwelling on its narrative. Its storytelling is pretty efficient and pretty abbreviated. However, that said, it does spend more time telling its story than the previous two Game Boy Advance titles, so you can expect to run into more characters who have a little more to say as you explore the castle in this game, relative to those first two titles. The premise of this game's story is a little random compared to other Castlevania games that I've played, in that you start as Soma Cruz, this young student who lives in Japan in the year 2035, and you wander up to a shrine on the night of a solar eclipse, and I forget why he's there, but he goes through the shrine gate and finds himself transported to Dracula's castle. Who knows how this happened, but it gives us another excuse to play a Castlevania game, so that's a good enough premise for me. One thing that sets this game apart from other Castlevania titles is that it was set in the future relative to the time it was released. So the story of this game is set in 2035. At least I think that's the date. Yep, 2035. And you don't see a lot of evidence of that future world the game takes place in. In fact, you spend pretty much the entire of the game just exploring another old rundown castle, and if nobody told me this was set in 2035, I wouldn't have really any way of knowing. So don't worry about this having any weird science fiction themes or aesthetics. It doesn't. It's another gothic horror adventure. The plot of this game is really just concerned with sorting through the mystery of why Soma was transported to this castle, and also why a few other characters he encounters within it were transported there. And it's a little bit predictable, or at least I found it a little more predictable and less interesting than the mysteries that were in Harmony of Dissonance, the previous Game Boy Advance Castlevania game. You will recognize one character if you played Symphony of the Night, at least, who looks awfully familiar and has a name that sounds awfully familiar. They weren't really fooling anybody who played Symphony of the Night with this character's appearance. I think the story of Aria of Sorrow functions just fine, but I do have to say that some of its leads or plot branches don't seem well developed, and it seems kind of like a lot of the events of this game's story are occurring off-screen, or at times and at places where the player is not. So I felt a little out of context at times, or like there were details missing from the story that are not fully explained or fleshed out. And by the end of the game, the way we get to where we are still seems a little undefined and mysterious to me. When I finished the game, I got an ending that I was pretty sure was not the only ending or the most ideal ending of the game, much like Harmony of Dissonance. Same thing happened when I played that one. And I didn't feel like going to the trouble of figuring out how to achieve a better ending, because Harmony of Dissonance made it clear that its best ending was hidden behind way too much tedium, and I can't be bothered, frankly, to figure out what tedium this game's best endings are hidden behind. I'd save it for a future playthrough and let that be part of this game's replay value, trying to figure that out. Now let's discuss the gameplay. Gameplay in Aria of Sorrow is very similar to Symphony of the Night and the derivative games of that one, which were also released on Game Boy Advance before this title. So you can expect to be exploring this castle and coming to dead ends, which you later need to revisit with new abilities. I saw a few new abilities I hadn't seen in any other Castlevania game, like the ability to walk on water, which was cool, or even the ability to move around underwater freely. This game did a nice job of messing around with new abilities to navigate the environments in it. Few people note the proper genre of the Castlevania games on Game Boy Advance. A lot of people just think of them as action platformer games or something like that, but the level up system and customization options of these Castlevania games on Game Boy Advance make all three of them action RPGs in my book. The level up system in this game works as good as the level up system did in the previous two and Symphony of the Night. Level scaling feels right. I never felt like I was struggling too much, and the progression of my character felt just right. Never had to level grind or anything. I approve of the balance of this game. The exploration was fairly easy. I didn't feel stumped in my traversal of these environments too often, and things generally felt pretty logical in terms of where I was supposed to go next and what ability I needed to go to a certain place. One criticism I can levy against this game, however, is that the arrangement of its save points and warp points could have been done better, at least from the perspective of player convenience. So I found again and again that warp points and save points were placed too far apart compared to other Castlevania games I've played. Over and over again, I would find that I would have to warp to a place and then do a lot of traveling to get to the nearest save point, backtracking through even more places I otherwise wouldn't have had to go to just to save. Saving could have been more convenient and player-friendly by just making the save points closer to where the warp points are. And then I would be able to warp around the castle as I'm exploring new pockets of it without having to significantly derail my journey to just save the game. One thing I like to pay a lot of attention to in the gameplay of the games I play is how it feels to move the player character around the environments, and that's particularly important for action games like this one. Of the three Castlevania games on GBA, I would say Harmony of Dissonance has the movement that I find most satisfying to play. The way you control in that game is just very nimble, and you can strafe very quickly and in rapid succession, which makes the movement and combat feel more liberated and free to me. The way Soma moves in Aria of Sorrow is a little more limited. For instance, when he does a backdash movement, that can only be done with the R button. It can't be done with both shoulder buttons, and it can't be done as rapidly. So you'll have to pause a little bit after you do it once. That makes Soma a little slower to move around, and not quite as fun in my opinion. But he still moves way better and more freely than you do in Circle of the Moon, because in that game you have to double tap the control pad in any direction you want to dash, and otherwise you have to move around at a very slow walking speed. In this game, they at least made the walking speed of Soma just one speed that is fast enough so you never feel like you're going too slow. The main gimmick and attraction of Castlevania Aria of Sorrow's RPG customization would be Soma's ability to absorb the souls of enemies he defeats and then use the abilities conferred on him by those souls to do a lot of crazy things. The crazy things these souls lets him do include battle abilities as well as abilities that have passive effects and environmental traversal effects. For instance, there's a soul that lets Soma float from falls more slowly so that he can float across gaps that otherwise couldn't be spanned without the ability to float. And there's also another one that lets him walk on water. And the abilities which grant Soma combat skills are even more varied, and there are more of those than I can properly go into that do a lot of interesting things, and I didn't even come close to uncovering all of them, I don't think. Or at least there were a decent amount I didn't. Basically, you have a chance every time you defeat any enemy in this game to absorb a soul from them, but it's all random luck. whether you do or not, and some enemies that are more rare may be harder to get souls from due to their rarity. I feel like experimenting with the different monster souls Soma can equip in this game is one of the most fun things about it, if not the best thing. See, he can equip 3 different souls all together, his soul set. And because there are a lot of different ones to choose from in each category, there are a lot of different combinations you can outfit him with to fit your style and play your own way. I made a lot of fun memories from messing around with souls in this game. For instance, I found one chamber in which there were a lot of enemies kind of like fleamen. They were some variant of fleamen, and in my arsenal was the ability to sick fleamen upon my enemies. Like, I could just toss fleamen at my foes, and the fleamen fight on my behalf. So, when I was met with this crowd of unruly fleamen enemies, I took the opportunity to wage fleaman war upon them, and sent my own throngs of fleamen to fight them, and defeat them. It was satisfying, fun, and amusing. There was another instance where I got the ability to hurl eagles, just throw eagles, and they fly. They just fly at whoever I hurl them at. That was fun. You don't get to hurl eagles in too many video games. And in the vein of throwing fauna at foes, I was also able to throw cats later, like a crazy cat person who just has a bunch of cats. You could just go around throwing cats at people in this game to defeat them. Make a challenge run out of it. Just go throw cats at everything in this game and make that the only thing you do. Great fun. I even got a vacuum cleaner made out of bones later that I could use to basically suck up the souls of monsters. That was cool. Little like Luigi in Luigi's Mansion. All of the different weapons he can equip. This is one thing that sets this game apart from Harmony of Dissonance and makes it a little more like Symphony of the Night. In Symphony of the Night, Alucard, who you played as, could use all sorts of different weapons from different classes. Things like knives, swords, but also some blunt weapons too, if I recall. And Soma is much the same in this game. He has a lot of different weapons he can equip, and you'll see things like knives, a ton of different swords, a hammer, and even a gun at one point, which is pretty ineffectual, but still kind of fun to see it there. And all these weapons have different ranges, as well as different power, so each weapon has its own benefits and drawbacks, and some of them are useful in specific situations. Another interesting difference between the weapons is that some have a different swing animation that makes them more useful in different situations. For example, some swords will have a swing that clears a lot of vertical space, but then others will have a stroke that's more like a stab, more of a piercing stab, so it won't have the air control of those other weapons that have a different sort of swing. It's fun seeing all the different weapon styles in this game. The sub-weapons traditionally found in many Castlevania games don't make a formal appearance in this game. However, I did find a few of those sub-weapons disguised in the form of monster abilities that you can use by absorbing their souls. For instance, I found at least one that allowed me to throw axes, kind of like you can do in a lot of other Castlevania games where the axe is a sub-weapon. Also, there is one equipable weapon, the whip sword, that lets Soma whip, kind of like Belmont characters do in other Castlevania games when they can equip a whip. So you can whip in this game, if you want to play more like 12 older Castlevania titles where you can only whip. Enemy diversity in this game is great, just like it was in Circle of the Moon and Harmony of Dissonance. There are lots of interesting monstrosities to look at. bosses are also well done again. There are fewer bosses overall here than there were in Harmony of Dissonance, but the quality of those bosses is very good. Even after the 2 Castlevania games I played on GBA before this one, which were in the same vein as Symphony of the Night, this game's bosses still felt refreshing. The developers found ways to throw some new things at you that you hadn't seen in the first 2 games. I would also say the bosses here are a little more difficult overall than the bosses in Harmony of Dissonance were, and maybe a little closer to difficulty of Circle of the Moon bosses. I got more game overs as I was attempting to defeat them, but the bosses still felt fair and fun. Let me also discuss the visuals, which are very strong in this game, as they were in the previous 2 Castlevania games on GBA. The sprite work is magnificent, and the sprite work of your player character is probably a little better here than it was in the last 2 Castlevania games. I do have to give it credit for that. Soma looks great, just a very detailed player sprite with a lot of different movements and animations. I can't really say the environments here, though, looked noticeably better than Harmony of Dissonance. I'll just say they're as good, which is to say, phenomenal. Beautiful backgrounds, tons of detail, great use of color, wonderful level themes that stand apart. It's another great Castlevania castle to explore. The audio of this game is also very strong, just like it was for the other Castlevania games I played on GBA, and Castlevania games in general. They generally have really good audio, I've noticed. Great soundtracks, great sound effects. And I don't have a ton to say about the sound effects, but that in and of itself is a compliment. Mastering and mixing all the sound effects to make sure nothing is too loud or stands out too much is an art. What I do have to say, though, about the sound effects is that they're punchy and satisfying. The soundtrack in this game is very strong, just as it is in most Castlevania games. To compare its quality, though, to the GBA games I played before this one, I would say Harmony of Dissonance sounded a little more abstract and experimental compared to this one. This soundtrack is a little more traditional in its symphonic and orchestral qualities, and it has more in common with Circle of the Moon and probably Symphony of the Night's soundtracks. One kind of odd thing I can note about the sound of this game is that there were a few areas I encountered that had no music at all. Maybe just like a handful, 3 or 4 areas. And it kind of seemed strange when I went to these areas because all of the other game did have music in the background, so those spots seemed strangely quiet. But at the very least, the areas with no music had some kind of ambient environmental noise in the background. I heard like water flowing in a place or two and stormy winds in an outdoor place. So there's that. I personally don't feel like this game's more traditional sounding soundtrack is quite as impactful or interesting as Harmony of Dissonance is, but I have to give it big credit for its sound quality. The sound quality of this soundtrack is superb, and one of the better ones on Game Boy Advance in that regard. The Game Boy Advance gets kind of unfair criticism for its sound abilities. If anybody out there needs to hear proof of the GBA sounding great, just go listen to the Golden Sun games or Pokemon Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. Those games sound amazing. And Aria of Sorrow sounds pretty good, kind of like those games. It took me around 9 hours to beat this game. It feels like it's about where it should be in length. It didn't overstay its welcome, and it didn't leave me wanting a lot more. That's all I have to say about Castlevania Aria of Sorrow. It's a superb game in the Castlevania series, another great one on GBA. There are no bad Castlevania games on Game Boy Advance, I'm happy to say, after playing all 3 of them. All 3 are absolutely worth the time to play if you like Castlevania games or games that have horror attributes, RPG mechanics, and just fun action and exploration. So definitely give Aria of Sorrow a shot. it is not a sorrowful gameplay experience. It's damn fun and totally worth your time.